Getting second citizenship in a European Union country opens up a whole new range of opportunities. It also comes with challenges, and today I'm going to talk about some perspectives on some of the best EU citizenships that you can get. So before we get into this, let me just tell you that there is no universal best. That's my philosophy in any of this offshore stuff. What's good for one person is not necessarily good for another person. I'm going to walk you through my thought process, mention a few specific countries, and kind of explain the pros and cons of having European Union citizenship as part of your mix. And if it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson, the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We are a boutique consultancy that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce their taxes, diversify and protect their assets, and increase their freedom and options with things like second passports. We're also the hosts of the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live, which anyone can attend. And there are a couple different ways to get European Union citizenship. Obviously, the citizenship itself is in France, or is in Germany, or is in Estonia, or Ireland, or Greece. But with having any of those citizenships or any of the others, you have the ability to live and work and study and travel as a citizen of that country. You know, having a Greek citizenship means you can get a Greek passport, you can travel as a Greek citizen, and if you also wanted to move to Dublin or Madrid or anywhere else in Europe, you can do that when you want. A little bit simplified there, but that's basically the deal. And so one of the main ways that, let's say, an American or a Canadian would qualify for European Union citizenship would be through descent. And so if you have a parent, grandparent, or a great-grandparent, sometimes they even let you go further back. Most countries in Europe have some kind of system. In fact, there's about 10 countries that allow you to go 3 generations back or even further, which opens up probably tens of millions of Americans who have an opportunity to get one of these high-quality, what we call generally Tier A passports. Most European Union countries have equal quality travel privileges to a U.S. or Canadian passport. And so if there ever came a time when you didn't want that U.S. or Canadian passport, you would have a relatively equal one that potentially you could go back and visit your home country. Malta also has a program. They don't call it Citizenship by Investment. It functions as kind of a hybrid where you are making a donation to the country. It's going to cost close to about $1 million for a single person to get their citizenship, and it's going to take you about 15 to 18 months to do it. You also have golden visa programs like Portugal, which potentially can lead towards citizenship. There's other requirements. You may need to learn the language. You may need to spend a little bit of time there. Some of them do lead to citizenship without physical presence. Others do require you to be there and to pay taxes. So there's the whole conversation of how that works is potentially a tax planning issue with golden visas. And there's other residence permits. You can certainly just move to Europe. If you're married to a European Union citizen, there are a couple of countries like France where they're more flexible on whether you need to actually live there to work towards citizenship. And so those are the ways that most people would get European Union citizenship. There are pros and cons, and we've talked about this at length. Certainly, any kind of future citizenship-based taxation, which is what the United States does, that even if you didn't live in that country, potentially they could ask you to pay tax. And so is there some chance that Germany will one day ask all the Germans living in Dubai, saying, hey, it's not fair that you get to be German and not pay anything. If you don't pay some other country, we'd like you to pay us, or some version of that. Is it possible? Yeah, maybe. I certainly have said that if you were to live as a German within the EU, there are plenty of tax incentives in the EU that we've talked about separately. I think that that would maybe be easier to deal with. And so, hey, I'm going to move to Italy. I'm going to pay 100,000 euros lump sum tax every year. I make 10 million euros a year. My tax rate's effectively 1%. I think Germany probably has, just in this example, less to say about that than someone who lives in Dubai, because you do have the EU and there is a cohesion there. So future citizenship-based tax, future wealth tax, future restrictions, regulations, reduction of freedoms. Who knows what that could be? The question is, would those restrictions be block-wide? Do they all get together? Well, I've talked about both sides, and I think it's worth evaluating the risk. It's certainly a possibility that some of that stuff could happen. I certainly think you're more likely to see 1 or 2 countries start to implement some version of that in the same way that you have some of the northern European countries which say, you can leave our country for tax purposes. It's not that hard procedurally, but for the first X number of years, unless you live in one of these places, you're going to keep paying. And so they do restrict you with a kind of form of citizenship-based taxation, but really more based on where your tax residence was, which happens to be where you were a citizen. For most people, right, where you're a citizen is where you've been paying taxes your entire life. And so if you leave a country like in Norway, the idea that you have to play by their rules for a while, you can't just go right to Dubai, go right to Monaco in many situations, that is maybe something that can be rolled out. And so I think that would be more likely on an individual level. And so then it comes down to, if I want to reduce my tax risk of having citizenship in a country that has great benefits. I can live in Europe. I have access. Myself, my kids, my family can work there. Let's say I'm planning on giving up my U.S. citizenship. Having the ability to go and get a job in Germany or Ireland or other high-paying countries, that's a good thing, right? You can get second citizenship in the Caribbean, but probably not a lot of great jobs for most of us in St. Lucia, right? And so you have to make sure that you've made your way. Whereas if you have European Union citizenship, you have that extra job security, the kids have options, you have a great passport you can travel on, you've got certain freedoms. The EU is probably better at that than as much as they're imperfect than let's say the United States. And so the issue then is, if I don't want the tax risk of maybe some country going nuts, live in a country that's smaller, live in a country that has to be competitive, live in a country, or at least have the citizenship of a country where maybe there's some kind of tax incentive, like a Portugal. I wouldn't call the government in Portugal super right-wing, but they realize that we need to be competitive. Countries like Italy finally realized we need to be competitive. If you're an Italian and you haven't paid taxes in Italy in recent years, you can come and take advantage of their tax incentive. You don't have to be a foreigner. You can be an Italian citizen. And so I would want to be either, if I'm concerned about taxes and I have an EU passport, either living within Europe and just kind of taking advantage of the different tax incentives there. I think maybe, as I said, that's more easy to handle. Or I'm going to want to choose a citizenship country where it's not Germany, it's not France, it's not Spain. Let's say a country that doesn't have a wealth tax, right? So I'm going to be less interested in a Northern European, like a Scandinavian passport. Obviously, Norway not part of the EU, but it has certain privileges within it. And obviously, again, some of those countries come with restrictions. France is going to start restricting its own tax residents to not only, as it has for many decades, moving to Monaco. Now they're starting to tighten up people who move to Belgium. So that's a passport that has some of those baked-in issues. I would avoid that one. Do I think that Bulgaria, with its relatively low taxes for people who live there, is going to start imposing rules on people who don't live there, especially when countries like Bulgaria, like Ireland, like some of the Baltics, have had historically large numbers of emigration? I think it's a harder push because it's in their culture, right? I mean, people who leave Ireland to go work somewhere else, it's a relatively common thing. People from many Eastern European countries who leave, relatively common and accepted thing. Not a common thing in the United States, people to go and leave to make money because they have to leave to make money. It's not in the historic culture. And that's perhaps why you don't have an expat culture in the US very much, and the expats are treated rather poorly. For tax and regulation purposes. So if I'm looking for a passport, I'm going to look at one of the smaller ones that maybe has a history of immigration, has lower taxes itself, knows they have to be competitive, and just doesn't have the resources or the desire of a smaller country, whereas the larger countries that already have wealth taxes might be an issue. Now, if I wanted to live in as many English-speaking countries as possible, here's the next standard. Ireland, you could argue, is routinely the best European Union citizenship that you can get, because in addition to being part of the EU and having the privilege to live all around, in addition to no matter what happens in the EU, you're the citizen of an English-speaking country, you also have what predates the European Union, which is an agreement with the UK to have free movement there. So now that post-Brexit, most Europeans don't have the same level of access they once did, Irish citizens still would. And so now you have two English-speaking countries, both of which potentially have tax incentives, potentially not if you're the citizen of one in that country, but you have kind of two big check marks for a lot of people ticked off right there with Ireland that you wouldn't have if, let's say, you were a Portuguese citizen. So Ireland has a number of different programs that you can live there and be given citizenship. They also have citizenship through parents or grandparents, in limited cases through great-grandparents. So it's not a passport that if you don't have ancestry is easy to get. You have to go and live there. And so you have to put a good amount of time in the ground. But if you like the idea of 5 or 6 years from now, having that optionality of the UK and the European Union, that could be an interesting one. For personal freedom, certainly what some people are telling me is both Europeans have come and said, hey, I'm willing to give up my citizenship in the Netherlands, in Germany, if it comes to it. Maybe we can start planning for that. People have been asking. For folks from non-EU countries who are looking, one country that stood out is Bulgaria, which has been more laissez-faire in their opinion. They've left more people alone. Potentially, again, they don't have the resources to go after people, but it's just also kind of a cultural thing. I think you've seen Western European countries where people have kind of lost the plot a little bit in terms of like, what is a loss of freedom? And I think in Eastern Europe that hasn't happened. So a country like Bulgaria could be interesting. They have numerous different programs where whether you make investment, whether you hire people, you don't necessarily have to go and live there all the time. it's going to take you a number of years to work towards that Bulgarian citizenship. And it's not quite as good as most of the other European ones, but that's one that's kind of stood out as being more freedom. There were, in the last couple of years, parts of Portugal, parts of Spain that were more open. And so that, you could make a case for those. You can define what freedom is, but those are a couple of countries that stood out as being more freedom. Obviously, if the goal is English speaking, then you're looking at an Ireland, you're looking at Malta, you're looking at potentially Cyprus, not as much. But those are countries that you could spend time in, and you've got big English-speaking populations, you've got native English. And all three of those countries, because of their historic relationship with the UK, have potentially friendly tax systems that you can avail of, at least potentially until that you are a citizen. There's a lot of different factors that go into their tax planning, and so I'm not giving you tax advice. But if you want an English-speaking country, now again, we don't always have to live in a country to be a citizen of it, right? You can get Maltese citizenship by making a donation. You can work towards, Cypriot citizenship. Or you can at least just hold a golden visa there. Ireland. So these are countries where if you don't qualify through descent, you can, in the case of Malta, just go through the donation process, or you can actually go and live there on potentially a tax-friendly basis, work towards the citizenship. Malta, by the way, same thing. People don't realize you can get a residence permit at Malta. You can spend time living there and then get the citizenship without making the $1 million donation. So those are a couple of options if you want English speaking. Obviously, I think the overall issue here, though, is, and by the way, for young parents, Portugal residents, whether it's a golden visa or others, if you're looking to give birth somewhere, the one country in Europe that is opened up to where if you're a resident for a year, you can give birth on Portuguese soil and your child becomes Portuguese. Does that really help you? Not so much. But if you were looking at Mexico, Panama, Brazil, that may be an opportunity where, hey, give the kid European citizenship at birth. It'll say right in their passport for as long as they live, place of birth Portugal. That could be interesting. And then they have that EU citizenship, even if you haven't gotten yours yet through your golden visa, through your residence permit. So for some young parents, that is appealing. Not that that's the only place that you can do that in the world, but generally mostly happens in the Americas. All that said, by the way, I think what people often fail to understand is if you are a citizen of Malta, you can go and live in Portugal, in Italy, in Greece, in Sweden, which is a place that people have certainly talked about in the last couple of years as well, in Ireland. You can potentially have one citizenship in the EU and then go and live in another EU country and get that citizenship too. It doesn't always work out that way, but it oftentimes is possible. You can get one and then say, hey, I'm going to go and live in Portugal. I'm going to use the NHR, tax incentive program. I'm going to obtain Portuguese citizenship in the future. And now I'm going to have 2 EU passports, and now I'm going to have more optionality. One that I got through my heritage, one that I got through making a donation, and one that I got by actually putting in some time there. And so the idea that you have access to live in all these countries if you wanted to, or not live there if you don't want to, the idea that you have so many different tax incentives, I do certainly think that there are some risks of holding top-tier passports as the world moves towards higher taxes, higher regulations, more confiscation of wealth. I think that you can somewhat insure against that. I think that you can also enjoy the benefits of having this citizenship, whether you're going to get it by donation, you're entitled to it by your descent. And so understanding that if you are Maltese, you can go and live in the other places. The idea of where do I find freedom, where do I speak English, where do I reduce my taxes, somewhat becomes a moot point in that so long as there's not some greater issue like a citizenship-based taxation, you're free to move within that block of countries and seek out a greater number of places. Much like, you say, hey, I'm living in California in the United States, this place is falling apart. I'm going to move to Florida, I'm going to move to Texas, I'm going to move to Arizona. It's not an entirely one-to-one comparison, but you will have that ability now with a whole block of over 24 countries to move between. And so having access to the union, so long as that continues in its current form, is potentially worth something, subject to the factors that we mentioned at the beginning. And so those are the things that I would think about if I were trying to get European Union access and a citizenship in one of the member countries.